The sun streamed through the towering glass windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was thick with tension. Every breath held as if anticipating a storm. At the center of it all sat Judge Edward Harrison, his sharp nose and thinning white hair lending him an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. His gavel struck the desk with a resounding crack, silencing the faint murmurs among the spectators. Across from him, Sarah Carter stood tall and composed. A calm, confident woman in her mid-30s. She was dressed in a sharp blazer, her expression unreadable but her presence commanding. Her brother, Jason Carter, sat beside her at the defense table. The weight of the accusations against him resisting arrest was visible in his slumped shoulders and the tight grip of his hands on the edge of the table. Judge Harrison's condescending smirk was impossible to miss. "Do you think you understand the law better than this court?" he sneered, his tone dripping with dismissal. The room fell silent. All eyes on Sarah. She didn't flinch. Her quiet strength hinted at a secret one that would soon shake the courtroom to its core. What happens next will leave the courtroom speechless, the narrator teases. Sarah Carter wasn't just fighting for her brother's freedom, she was fighting for justice in a system that had failed him. The Fulton County Courthouse was a towering structure of glass and steel, its imposing facade exuding authority and tradition. Inside, the grandeur of the building was even more striking. High vaulted ceilings loomed above, adorned with intricate moldings that whispered of an era long past. Marble floors stretched out in every direction, their polished surfaces reflecting the sunlight streaming through expansive windows. The air was cool, almost sterile, carrying a faint scent of wood polish and tension. In courtroom 4B, rows of wooden benches lined the gallery, filled with a mix of spectators, curious onlookers, reporters, and community members invested in the trial's outcome. The defendant's table was positioned near the center of the room, a stark focal point under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was here that Jason Carter sat, a man whose broad shoulders and strong frame seemed out of place next to the vulnerability etched on his face. Weeks of accusations had stripped away his usual confidence. His dark eyes, framed by exhaustion, darted nervously around the room. Jason's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. His younger sister, Sarah Carter, sat beside him, her posture a stark contrast to his. She was calm, poised, her dark brown eyes unwavering as they scanned the room. She reached over, placing a hand on Jason's arm. "Stay calm, Jason," she whispered, her voice steady and soothing. "The truth always comes out. We just have to hold on." Her tone carried a quiet authority, the kind that spoke of resilience and unwavering determination. The courtroom doors creaked open, and the murmurs in the gallery hushed instantly. All eyes turned to the figure entering the room, Judge Edward Harrison. His black robe billowed slightly as he strode to his seat, his sharp features set in a permanent scowl. In his late 60s, with thinning white hair and a hooked nose, Harrison exuded an air of superiority. He was a man with a reputation, harsh, impatient, and unapologetically biased. For him, this trial was just another notch in his gavel, a mere formality. Judge Harrison settled into his high-backed chair, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room. His lips curled into a faint smirk as his eyes landed on Sarah and Jason. "Let's get this over with," he muttered under his breath. but loud enough for those in the front rows to hear. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, rose from his seat with a theatrical flourish. His every movement deliberate and exaggerated. Adjusting his navy tie, he strode to the center of the courtroom with the confidence of a man convinced of his own brilliance. A tall, clean-cut figure in his early 40s. Reed was the epitome of smug arrogance. "Your Honor," Reed began, his tone oozing with feigned gravitas. "The evidence against the defendant is clear and irrefutable. Jason Carter blatantly resisted arrest and endangered the lives of law enforcement officers. No amount of excuses or distractions can change that." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, glancing briefly at the jury as though he had already won them over. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, her expression unreadable. Reed continued, painting a vivid picture of Jason as a dangerous and defiant individual. His words twisted the narrative, ignoring key evidence that contradicted his claims. To the spectators, it sounded rehearsed, more performance than fact. Sarah glanced at her brother, her hand still steady on his arm. Jason's shoulders stiffened as Reed's words cut deeper. But Sarah's calm presence seemed to anchor him. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let him get to you. This is just the beginning." The tension in the room was palpable, every word from Reed driving it higher. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes darting between the prosecutor and Sarah. The faint smirk on his face remained, as if he had already made up his mind. But Sarah wasn't here to let them control the narrative. Not today. She held her composure, knowing that the moment to act was drawing closer. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Sarah Carter rose from her seat. The murmur of whispers quieted, replaced by an oppressive silence as all eyes turned toward her. She smoothed the front of her blazer, her movements deliberate and measured. With every step toward the witness stand, the sharp click of her heels echoed against the marble floor, a sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. She reached the stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore her oath. The court stenographer, fingers poised over her keys, waited for Sarah's testimony. Judge Edward Harrison leaned back in his high-backed chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, watching her with the faintest trace of a smirk. "Miss Carter," the prosecutor, Daniel Reed, began, his tone carefully neutral but tinged with skepticism. "You're here today as a character witness for your brother, Jason Carter. Can you tell the court about your observations?" Sarah nodded slightly, her expression calm. "Jason is my older brother," she began, her voice steady and clear. "He's a kind, hard-working man who's always been there for his family. On the day of his arrest, Jason was targeted unfairly. The events that led to this trial were escalated unnecessarily." Reed cut her off with a dramatic wave of his hand. "Miss Carter, let's stick to the facts," he said, a faint edge of irritation creeping into his voice. "This court is interested in the specifics, not personal anecdotes." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I am speaking to the facts." Jason's actions were calm and non-threatening. The video evidence shows this clearly. His arrest was not justified. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his voice dripping with condescension. "Miss Carter, while we appreciate your perspective, you seem awfully confident about matters of law enforcement for someone who isn't." Shall we say? In the field. Tell me. Do you think you're an expert? The gallery chuckled softly at the judge's remark. But Sarah remained unshaken. She straightened her posture, her dark eyes locking with the judge's. Her calm demeanor didn't waver, though there was a new resolve in her voice. Your Honor, I'm here to provide testimony to the truth of what happened, not to claim expertise. Judge Harrison smirked, leaning back further in his chair. Truth, he drawled mockingly. A very noble idea. But one best left to those who understand the intricacies of the law. The comment was a deliberate jab, designed to undermine her credibility. Sarah felt a flicker of anger deep in her chest. But she forced it down. This wasn't the time to react emotionally. Instead, she drew a slow breath, her resolve hardening. With all due respect, Your Honor, she replied evenly. The truth isn't complicated. It's visible. Plain as day. If you're willing to see it. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. But Judge Harrison silenced them with a glare. Miss Carter, he said, his tone turning icy. We deal in evidence, not feelings. If you have nothing more relevant to add, perhaps we should move on. Sarah nodded slightly, the faintest smile curving her lips. She stepped down from the stand, her gaze sweeping over the room. Jason looked up at her as she returned to her seat, his expression a mixture of worry and gratitude. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. It's not over, she whispered, her voice low but firm. Trust me, Jason. The truth always comes out. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. While Sarah's testimony had been met with resistance, it was clear that her quiet confidence had left an impression. Judge Harrison, however, was unrelenting. He glanced down at his notes, his lips curling into a smirk once more. To him, she was nothing more than a sister defending her brother, a figure he could easily dismiss. But what no one in that room knew, not even the judge, was the secret Sarah carried. Behind her composed exterior and carefully measured words was a wealth of experience that would soon change the trajectory of the trial. She wasn't just Jason Carter's sister. She was Special Agent Sarah Carter of the United States Secret Service. And while she hadn't revealed it yet, the moment would come. For now, she waited, biding her time, letting the courtroom play out its preconceived biases. When the time was right, she would speak again. And this time, her words would carry the full weight of her authority. The tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. Every word from Judge Harrison and the prosecutor, Daniel Reed, felt like another brick stacked against Jason Carter. Sarah sat still, her posture straight, her expression composed. But beneath the surface, she was bracing for the moment she knew had to come. It was time to act. The prosecutor was wrapping up another tirade, painting Jason as a dangerous and defiant man. Your Honor, it's clear that the defendant has no regard for law enforcement. The evidence supports the charge of resisting arrest, and I see no reason to entertain further theatrics from the defense. Reed concluded with a smug smile, gesturing dismissively toward Sarah and Jason. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his thin fingers steepled. Does the defense have anything more to add? He asked, his tone bored. Or are we ready to move on? The defense attorney hesitated, his confidence visibly shaken under the weight of the judge's authority. He glanced at Sarah. Unsure. But before he could respond, she rose to her feet. The movement was deliberate, slow, and commanding. The gallery murmured in surprise, their whispers buzzing like electricity through the air. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice calm but steady, "I would like to address the court directly." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of irritation and bemusement. "Miss Carter, I believe we've already heard enough from you. Unless you have something relevant to add, I suggest you take your seat." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "What I'm about to say is not only relevant, it's critical to the integrity of this courtroom and this case." Her words, delivered with quiet authority, silenced the murmurs. Even Judge Harrison seemed momentarily taken aback by the weight in her tone. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing dismissively. "You have 2 minutes," he said. "Make it quick." Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She reached into her blazer pocket. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. From within, she pulled out a small, black leather wallet. With practiced ease, she flipped it open and held it aloft. The badge inside caught the light, gleaming brightly as gasps rippled through the courtroom. "My name," she began, her voice clear and deliberate, "is Special Agent Sarah Carter of the United States Secret Service." The room erupted into stunned murmurs. The prosecutor froze, his confident demeanor faltering as the realization of her words hit him. Judge Harrison's expression shifted from condescension to disbelief, his smirk vanishing like a candle snuffed out. Sarah let the weight of the moment settle before continuing. "For the past 10 years, I've served this country, protecting its leaders and upholding the laws that govern it. I've conducted investigations, managed high-stakes operations, and worked tirelessly to ensure that justice is upheld. And I am here today, not just as Jason Carter's sister, but as someone who understands the law and the ways it can be abused." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The gallery, stunned into silence, watched her with wide eyes. Even the court stenographer seemed momentarily frozen, her fingers hovering over the keys. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Agent Carter," he began, his voice shaky as he tried to regain control. "While your credentials are impressive, I fail to see how they're relevant to this case." "Oh. They're very relevant, Your Honor," Sarah interjected, her tone sharp but controlled. She stepped closer to the jury, her badge still visible. "Because they speak to my experience, my credibility, and my ability to recognize when power is being misused. What we've seen in this courtroom today is a prime example of that misuse." The judge's face flushed with color, and he opened his mouth to respond. But Sarah didn't give him the chance. "From the moment this trial began," she continued, "my brother has been painted as a criminal. Not because of what he did, but because of how he looks. The evidence clear. Undeniable video footage shows he was shoved to the ground without provocation. Yet this court has allowed the prosecution to ignore it. Why?" Her gaze swept the room, landing on the jury. "Why is it that Jason Carter, a calm and cooperative man, was treated like a threat? Why is it that the officer's aggression has been excused, while my brother's innocence has been questioned? The answer is bias. Bias that permeates our law enforcement and justice system at every level. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel, his voice cracking. Agent Carter. That's enough. This is a court of law, not a stage for personal grievances. Sarah turned to him, her gaze unyielding. This is a court of law, Your Honor. A place where justice should be impartial. And yet, it's clear that the system is failing to uphold that standard, not just for my brother, but for countless others like him. The gallery erupted into whispers again. And this time, the judge couldn't silence them. Sarah took a step back, her presence commanding. I came here today to testify as a sister. But I stand here now as an officer of the law, calling for accountability. Jason Carter deserves justice, and this courtroom has an obligation to deliver it. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Judge Harrison, his face a deep shade of red, gripped the edge of his bench, his authority crumbling under Sarah's quiet defiance. Sarah returned to her seat beside Jason, her expression calm but resolute. She placed her badge on the table in front of her, a silent reminder of her authority. Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of awe and gratitude. It's not over yet, she whispered to him. But the tide has turned. For the first time, Jason allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. Across the room, the prosecutor shuffled his papers nervously, while Judge Harrison stared down at his desk, his confidence visibly shaken. Sarah's stand had changed everything. The courtroom was no longer a place where bias could operate unchecked. The truth, as she had promised, was beginning to break through. The courtroom erupted into quiet chaos the moment Judge Harrison called for a recess. Spectators whispered fervently among themselves, their hushed conversations tinged with shock and admiration for Sarah Carter's bold revelation. Reporters quickly began scribbling in their notebooks, some already stepping into the hallways to make frantic phone calls, eager to break the news. Even the court staff, usually a model of professionalism, exchanged wide-eyed glances, their faces betraying a mixture of disbelief and awe. At the defense table, Jason turned to Sarah, his voice trembling with both relief and fear. Angie, what just happened? Did you see the way he looked at you? That judge, he's furious. Sarah placed a steadying hand on her brother's shoulder, her expression calm and composed. Let him be furious, she said softly. This isn't about his emotions, Jason. This is about the truth. And the truth is on our side. Jason shook his head, still visibly shaken. But what if it's not enough? What if he shuts us down again? Sarah leaned closer, her voice firm but gentle. Jason, look around. Do you hear what they're saying? We're turning the tide. People are paying attention now. That matters. She squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. We're not done yet. But we're in this together. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was buzzing. Reporters huddled in small groups, discussing the implications of Sarah's revelation. A Secret Service agent, one whispered. In this case, this changes everything. A few activists who had been following Jason's trial from the beginning stood near the gallery doors, their faces lit with hope for the first time in weeks. Even the bailiff, who usually maintained a stoic demeanor, paused to glance at Sarah as he passed. "Agent Carter," he said quietly, with a small nod of respect. Sarah returned the nod, her calm exterior betraying nothing of the storm that had just swept through the courtroom. Jason leaned against the wall, still processing the moment. "I don't know how you stay so calm." "Angie," he said, his voice low. "They keep trying to twist everything. But you don't let it get to you." Sarah turned to him, her gaze steady. "Because I've learned to pick my moments. Jason. They want us to react. They want us to get emotional so they can discredit us. But if we stay focused, if we let the truth do the work, they can't win." When the recess ended, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and the spectators filed back into their seats. The energy in the room had shifted. There was a new tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that the trial had taken an unexpected turn. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, his face carefully neutral, though the tightness around his mouth betrayed his lingering frustration. He settled into his chair with a deliberate air of control, striking his gavel to call the court back into session. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, his voice echoing through the room. Once everyone was seated, Harrison spoke. "Let's continue. But I will remind everyone present this is a court of law, not a stage for dramatics." Sarah, seated beside Jason, caught the judge's gaze. She didn't flinch. Her calm defiance was palpable, and it unnerved him more than any outburst could have. The defense attorney, emboldened by Sarah's earlier stand, rose to his feet with newfound determination. His voice, previously hesitant, now carried a steadiness that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor," he began, his tone measured but firm, "I would like to revisit the video evidence that was previously introduced. This footage is not only relevant, it is pivotal to understanding the truth of what happened during Jason Carter's arrest." Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed, but he gestured for the attorney to proceed. The bailiff stepped forward, loading the video evidence onto the courtroom's projector. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh glow over the room. The room fell silent as the footage began to play. The grainy video showed Jason standing by his car, his posture calm, his hands visible and non-threatening. The officer approached aggressively, barking orders, escalating the situation without cause. When Jason calmly asked why he was being detained, the officer shoved him to the ground. The sound of his body hitting the pavement echoed through the room, followed by the officer drawing his weapon unnecessarily. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The video left no room for interpretation. It was clear that Jason had been targeted unfairly. Sarah's hand tightened into a fist beneath the table, but her face remained composed. The defense attorney paused the video at a critical moment. "Your Honor. Members of the jury," he said, turning to face them. "This footage speaks for itself. Jason Carter did not resist arrest. He was compliant, calm, and cooperative. The officer's actions were not only unwarranted, they were dangerous." Sarah's eyes scanned the jury as the video played again, this time in slow motion. She saw their expressions shift, confusion giving way to discomfort, then anger. A middle-aged woman in the second row leaned forward, her brow furrowed as if re-evaluating everything she had heard. Another juror, a young man in his 20s, glanced briefly at Jason, his lips pressed into a thin line of guilt. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, rose to his feet. His movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Your Honor," he began, his voice louder than necessary. "While the video may be compelling, it does not negate the officer's testimony. The law gives officers discretion in volatile situations." Sarah cut him off with a sharp look. Rising from her seat. "Volatile?" she asked. Her voice calm but cutting. Jason was standing with his hands visible, asking a question. What about that was volatile? Was it his tone? His posture? Or was it simply the color of his skin? Her words sliced through the room, leaving the prosecutor momentarily speechless. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Sarah turned to the jury, her gaze steady. "This case is about more than my brother. It's about a system that allows people in power to act without accountability. That officer's actions were caught on tape. And yet we're here, questioning Jason's integrity instead of the officer's abuse of power." Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Agent Carter." "That's enough," he snapped, his voice cracking under the pressure. Sarah didn't flinch. She returned to her seat. Her point made. The jury's expressions made it clear they had seen the truth. Jason leaned toward Sarah, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they saw it? Do you think they believe me now?" Sarah placed a steadying hand on his arm. "They saw it, Jason. The truth is undeniable. Now it's up to them to act on it." As the courtroom settled into silence, the balance of power had shifted. The truth, as Sarah had promised, was finally beginning to break through. The courtroom doors closed with a heavy thud as the jury filed out to begin their deliberations. The weight of their task hung thick in the air, leaving behind a deafening silence. Jason Carter sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white with tension. His sister, Sarah, sat beside him, her calm presence an anchor in the storm of uncertainty. Jason leaned toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Angie, what if it's not enough? What if they can't see past their biases?" Sarah turned to him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Jason," she said softly but firmly, "you've told the truth. The evidence is there. Now it's their turn to do what's right." She placed a hand over his, her touch warm and grounding. "No matter what happens, we've already won in one way. They know the truth now. And that's a start." Jason nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the polished wood of the table. The minutes stretched on, each tick of the courtroom clock amplifying the tension. Sarah, her composure unbroken, glanced toward the gallery. Spectators whispered among themselves, the air buzzing with speculation, while reporters tapped furiously on their devices, ready to break the verdict the moment it came. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy double doors creaked open, and the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The jury has reached a verdict." The spectators stood, their collective anticipation palpable. Sarah and Jason rose as well, Jason's legs trembling slightly under the weight of the moment. Sarah placed a steadying hand on his arm, her calm presence a quiet reassurance. Across the room, Judge Harrison entered, his robe swishing as he took his seat, his expression carefully neutral but betraying a flicker of unease. "Be seated," Judge Harrison commanded. His voice sharp yet strained. The jury foreperson. A middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her hair. Stood with a folded piece of paper in hand. Her face was unreadable. But her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. The room was silent. Save for the faint rustling of fabric as the foreperson cleared her throat. "Your Honor," she began. Her voice shaky but audible. "The jury has reached a unanimous decision." Jason gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his fingers ached. Sarah glanced at him. Her face calm but her dark eyes reflecting the weight of the moment. On the charge of resisting arrest, the foreperson continued. "We find the defendant, Jason Carter, not guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment. Their weight sinking into the hearts and minds of everyone in the room. Then, like a dam breaking, a wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery. And some spectators even clapped quietly before stopping under the judge's sharp glare. Jason staggered slightly. His knees buckling as the tension of weeks, months even, finally released. Tears streamed down his face as he buried his head in his hands. Overwhelmed by relief, Sarah placed both hands on his shoulders, steadying him as he let out a shuddering breath. "You're free, Jason," she whispered. Her voice thick with emotion but still strong. "It's over." Jason looked up at her. His tear-filled eyes filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't have made it without you," he said, his voice cracking. Sarah smiled softly. A rare moment of vulnerability crossing her face. "You would have," she replied. "But I'm glad you didn't have to." Judge Harrison's face was an unflattering shade of red as he gripped the arms of his chair. His gavel rested forgotten on the bench. His authority undermined in a way he hadn't anticipated. He cleared his throat. The sound loud and strained in the quiet room. "This court is adjourned," he said curtly, his voice lacking its usual edge of confidence. He struck the gavel once. A hollow echo that seemed to mock him. And rose to leave the room. His robe billowed as he exited. But there was no power in his stride. Only a stiff, mechanical motion that betrayed his discomfort. For a man who had built his reputation on control and authority, this moment was a rare and public defeat. As the courtroom began to empty, reporters swarmed the gallery. Cameras flashing and questions flying. Sarah stood firm. Her hand still on Jason's shoulder. She ignored the chaos around them, focusing only on her brother. Jason turned to her, his voice still shaking. "You did this, Angie. You stood up to him. To all of them." Sarah shook her head. "No, Jason. We did this together. You had the courage to stand tall even when it felt impossible. Don't ever forget that." As they stepped outside the courthouse, the cool breeze of the late afternoon hit them. The sun was dipping low in the sky, painting the city in hues of gold and amber. Jason stopped on the steps, taking a deep breath as if he were inhaling freedom itself. Sarah stood beside him, her expression calm but her heart full. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment to feel the victory not just for Jason but for the truth that had finally come to light. A reporter called out from the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. "Agent Carter. What's next for you and your brother?" Sarah turned to face them, her expression resolute. "Today, Justice was served for Jason Carter, she said firmly. But this is just one case. There are so many others who don't get this chance. And we can't stop fighting until the system works for everyone. She glanced at Jason, who nodded in agreement. Together, they descended the steps, moving past the crowd and into the city streets. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, they both felt hope. And as they walked away, side by side, the courthouse stood behind them, a towering reminder of the battle they had just won and the work still left to do. Outside the courthouse, the steps were alive with activity. Reporters crowded together, their cameras flashing, their voices calling out in rapid succession as Sarah and Jason emerged from the heavy wooden doors. The late afternoon sun bathed the scene in a golden glow, a stark contrast to the emotional storm that had played out within the courtroom walls. Jason, his face still damp with tears of relief, stood close to his sister. Sarah, composed as ever, stepped forward to address the press. Her dark blazer was sharp against the sunlight, her posture radiating quiet authority. "Agent Carter, what are your thoughts on today's verdict?" one reporter shouted. "Do you believe justice was served?" asked another. Sarah raised her hand slightly, signaling for calm. The crowd quieted, hanging on her every word. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but firm. "Today is a victory," she began, her gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. "But the fight for justice is far from over. My brother was lucky. He had evidence and support that so many others don't. We can't stop here. We must continue to challenge the biases and inequities in our justice system so that fairness is not the exception, but the rule." Jason nodded beside her, his expression a mix of gratitude and determination. Reporters continued to shout questions, but Sarah placed a protective hand on Jason's back, guiding him down the steps toward the waiting car. Their message had been delivered. And for now, that was enough. In a modest community center, Jason stood before a group of young people, his voice steady and impassioned as he shared his story. "I was wrongfully accused," he said. "But my sister fought for me. She taught me to fight too, not just for myself, but for others." The teens listened intently, some nodding in understanding. Jason's words resonated, inspiring hope in those who had faced similar struggles. Meanwhile, Sarah had found a new balance. By day, she continued her duties as a special agent, protecting the country's leaders. By night, she lent her voice to justice reform panels, community forums, and advocacy efforts. She became a beacon of hope, a symbol that change was possible. For Sarah and Jason, the road ahead was long, but they were ready. Together, they had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. And this was just the beginning. As the camera focuses on Sarah Carter, she stands alone on the courthouse steps, the world quieting around her. The bustling reporters and crowd fade into the background, leaving her center stage. She looks directly into the lens, her gaze unwavering, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "Justice is not guaranteed," she begins, her words deliberate. "It's something we must demand, fight for, and protect. What happened to my brother, Jason, wasn't an isolated incident. It's a reality faced by countless people every single day, individuals who are judged not for their actions, but for the way they look or the assumptions people make about them. She pauses, letting the weight of her words sink in. We've seen how the system can be flawed, how it can fail the very people it's meant to protect. But change is possible. It starts with awareness, with courage, and with the willingness to hold those in power accountable. That's not just the responsibility of the courts, it's the responsibility of all of us. Sarah steps forward, her expression resolute. I'm asking you, as a viewer, as a citizen, to take a moment and reflect. How can we challenge systemic biases? How can we amplify voices that are so often silenced? How can we create a system that values truth over power and fairness over prejudice? Her voice softens, but her determination remains. The fight for justice doesn't end here. It's a movement, and it needs every one of us to keep it going. Stand up. Speak out. Be the change. Together, we can build a world where justice truly is for all. A call to action message appears: join the conversation. Demand change. Stand for justice.